Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. Thanks for joining me in another episode of Keep It Real. Last time we did an episode on an interesting study that was published in a journal called The Lancet, which is one of the top tier medical journals out of the UK. And what they did is they evaluated over 130,000 subjects from 18 different countries, 5 different continents, and they wanted to evaluate the macronutrient intake. Remember, macronutrients are fats, carbohydrates, and proteins as they relate to all-cause mortality. And then they specifically looked at cardiovascular disease and stroke. And here's a quick summary, is that those who consumed a higher carbohydrate diet had an increased risk factor of all-cause mortality. In other words, dying younger than those who made other food choices. And on the flip side, those who consumed a higher fat diet had a decreased risk factor for all-cause mortality. And then because let's say kind of the current guidelines suggest that a higher fat diet is what leads to heart disease, they specifically looked at that. And they actually found that the higher fat diet did not lead to increased risk factor for heart disease. And in fact, they found an inverse relationship between saturated fat and risk factor for stroke. In other words, the more saturated fat that was consumed, the decreased risk factor for stroke. So it would seem, based on these results, that some of the international guidelines for macronutrient intake needs to be revisited, and probably further studies to help confirm these particular results should happen as well. But it got me thinking a little bit about a couple different aspects that I think are really contributing to these interesting results, and they're both based in science, and I'll cite another study in just a moment. But why might this be happening? Why would a lower carbohydrate and a higher fat diet improve health outcomes and decrease risk factor for dying younger? So one of them is, we know that a higher carbohydrate diet is going to lead to higher glucose. The more glucose that is consumed, then there's a higher risk that some of that glucose is going to be glycated, which means the glucose starts binding to proteins in the body, and that leads to a very inflammatory chemical. And there's a common blood test that we use to monitor this reaction. It's called hemoglobin A1C, or HbA1c, and another name for it is called glycated hemoglobin. So we're looking at this glycation process of sugar and a protein molecule sticking together, and it's considered one of our inflammation markers. And it's also a marker of blood sugar metabolism. So oftentimes it's evaluated in those who have prediabetes or diabetes to help us determine if their blood sugar issues are being controlled. So it's a very common study because that's a really nasty molecule, that glycation. So as carbohydrates go up, the chance of this type of glycation goes up. And we know that inflammation is rooted in so many different health conditions like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, so many different things of our chronic diseases that we're really dealing with today have inflammation really as a root. So that's one, I think, piece of this concept that a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet is healthier in general. Number two is, from the higher fat side of the equation, is that when we consume more fats, typically the other macronutrients are going to go down, particularly carbohydrates. Fats have more of a satiating effect, and typically when there's more fats that are consumed, there's less cravings for carbohydrates. That's one factor. But further on that concept is that when we consume more fats, and particularly in a diet where there are lower carbohydrates, the body, the liver particularly, forms a particular energy molecule called a ketone. And we've talked in past episodes about the ketogenic diet, which is a very specific type of diet with certain fat and carbohydrate ratios to really induce high levels of ketones. But even from a low carbohydrate, higher fat diet, without being as extreme as a ketogenic diet, ketones are still going to be formed. And these ketones have multiple beneficial properties that we know from many studies have multiple health benefits in the body, including anti-inflammation, including balancing blood sugar, including supporting the immune system, and it goes on and on. Supporting energy, definitely very excellent form of fuel for the brain. And so we're learning more and more about ketones and their beneficial effects on the body. So this is, the second of the two that I'm kind of mentioning today, benefits of a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet, and that is better glucose metabolism from the lower carbohydrate diet and decreased chance of this kind of glycation inflammatory molecule forming, and then the healthy molecule forming from a higher fat diet producing more ketones in the liver. So those are two really key benefits. And then I wanted to really review current literature on ketones, and something has recently been brought to my attention that there's a way to improve, or let's say increase the speed at which we can develop ketosis or elevated ketones in the body, which we know have a beneficial health outcome. And that's by consuming exogenous ketones. So we can naturally produce ketones in the body in this type of higher fat, lower carbohydrate intake, but there's now ways that scientists have developed these exogenous ketones where we could consume these ketones and allow us to go into a state of ketosis even faster and reap the benefits of elevated ketones even quicker. And there might be certain cases where this would not be indicated, but for a lot of people, this could be an important health benefit. And so I wanted to evaluate the efficacy of this. And it's interesting, on the day that I was looking for this research, it was actually October 30th, just 2 days ago, and the study that I had in my hand and was reading was actually published that day. I printed it out, and it was the actual day that study was published, and it was in a journal called The Frontiers of Physiology, and it was by researchers out of Oxford in the UK. And the basic conclusion that they came to is that by taking exogenous ketones is an efficacious, or let's say effective, way of boosting ketosis in the body. So this is an interesting concept that I think we're going to learn more and more about. And as the studies come out, of course, I'll present that information for you in one of these episodes. So stay tuned for more about that. In the meantime, based on these studies, it's really important to maintain a lower carbohydrate diet. And I'm not talking about a no carbohydrate diet or an extremely restrictive carbohydrate diet, because we know carbohydrates are an excellent fuel source. So this is not a concept about very, very low, extreme kind of dieting. In fact, that's extremely unsustainable for most people. But we're talking about moderate use of carbohydrates and nudging up the fats, because we went through decades where fats were really vilified, and people, they were very misunderstood. And now we're understanding that information was not really accurate as our laboratory science gets more sophisticated and we're able to ask better questions and come up with better answers. So hope that information is useful. Enjoy those dietary changes, and I'd love to hear how those experiences have affected your health. So stay tuned, and we'll talk to you next time. Until then, keep it real.